We thank Grant Thornton for serving as the program sponsor of this week, helping to make possible our morning lecture series on media and the news, ethics in the digital age. Today's lecture is underwritten by the Robert Jacobs Memorial Lectureship Fund. The Jacobs Lectureship Fund was established by H. Louise Tice Jacobs in honor of her husband, Bob. All three of their children, along with their spouses, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, have become Chautauquans. Please join me in thanking the Jacobs family and all of you for your continued support of Chautauqua. Joining us this morning is Arzu Geybulla, an Azerbaijani journalist and social media trainer. As a correspondent, Mrs. Geybulla focuses on human rights and press freedoms in Azerbaijani. She has written for several publications, including Al Jazeera, Open Democracy, and Global Voices, and she is a correspondent for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, an organization she first joined in 2014 as a Václav Havel Journalism Fellow. She also serves as an associate scholar at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, where she provides analysis on the situation in Azerbaijan. Previously, Mrs. Geybulla worked as a co-director and facilitator of the Imagine Center for Conflict Transformation and an analyst for the European Stability Initiative. Ms. Geybulla was featured as one of the BBC's 100 Women Changemakers in 2014, and in 2016, she joined the George Washington University faculty as a visiting scholar. This is her first visit to Chautauqua. Her lecture is entitled Digital Media in Authoritarian States, Case of Azerbaijan. Please join me in welcoming Arzu Geybulla to the platform.
Thank you. Wow. I'm so grateful to be here today. I think this is by far one of the biggest audience I've spoken to ever. So thank you once again to the organizers for having me here. And thank you to this audience for coming here today. It is an honor to be speaking here on behalf of my colleagues, friends, and many other unjustly silenced voices in Azerbaijan. Henry Luce, co-founder of Time magazine, once said, "I became a journalist to come as close as possible to the heart of the world." I became a journalist to come as close as possible to the heart of storytelling, to share stories about the country I come from and I'm deeply passionate about. So today, I would like to share with you some of the stories that reflect the grim reality of the state of media freedom in Azerbaijan, as well as my own. So where is Azerbaijan, and what can I tell you about it? As you can see on the map, it's quite far from here. Azerbaijan is a small nation of just 9.8 million. It shares a border with Russia, Iran, Caspian Sea, Georgia, and Armenia. And yet, it is a country with the highest number of political prisoners per capita. Its leaders won't tell you about this. In fact, much of what I'm about to share with you today, they won't like. But then, that is why I cannot travel back to Azerbaijan and live in self-imposed exile. Now, going back to Azerbaijan's history, I can tell you that its history dates back as far as to the Stone Age, that the territory of what is today Azerbaijan was ruled by several dynasties throughout history, and at some point it was a place of fire worshipping. Azerbaijan was ruled by Caucasian Albanians, by Oghuz Turks from the Central Asia, by the Persian Empire, by the Russian Empire in the 19th century, until its brief independence in 1918. And it's important to focus on this brief period because at the time of 1918, when Azerbaijan declared its independence, it was the first independent and modern parliamentary republic in the Muslim world and the first Muslim state to extend suffrage to women and grant women equal political rights. However, its independence was short-lived. Just 23 months after its declaration of independence, Azerbaijan was taken over by the Soviet Russia, where Azerbaijan remained for the next 70 years. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. The first years of independence were tough. The new republic faced economic collapse, domestic political chaos, and an ethnic war with neighboring Armenia over the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan's first democratic election took place in 1992, but its leader was ousted a year later by former KGB strongman, a man named Heydar Aliyev, who was appointed by Brezhnev during the Soviet Union to rule Azerbaijan. In 1994, just a year after taking the presidential seat, Heydar Aliyev signed the contract of the century. It was a production sharing agreement with a consortium of Western oil companies to tap into the deep water oil fields that were untouched during the Soviet Union. These oil fields on the contract promised a future of economic growth, jobs, international presence, and an anchor for a Western presence in the country. But in the meantime, rather than laying the foundations for lasting economic and political development, Azerbaijani leadership fell victim to what a lot of experts and academics describe these days as resource curse or paradox of plenty. Now, what it means, it's a condition whereby negative economic and political outcomes and misguided interests are able to prevail in the absence of strong domestic institutions and long-term sustainable growth and development plans. So basically, in the battle between democracy and the country's untapped energy reserves, the latter won. This is Heydar Aliyev, and this is his son Ilham Aliyev, whom I'm about to tell you. Now, the consequences of this decision of choosing energy over democracy were catastrophic. Without any internal mechanisms of control, we, the people, found ourselves in a state where fraudulent elections, corruption, dismantled legal system, systematic crackdown on critics became a norm. Just go back. The only institution that kept flourishing was that of the ruling family, of course. Clan members took over key government positions. The country was literally divided among family members and key power holders. And this is the case today. Clientelism, impunity, favoritism are key words that are used to describe Azerbaijan these days. And every single constitutional change or legal amendment has only given more powers to the family vis-à-vis their positions in the government. By 2002, the president, Heydar Aliyev, this man, had the power to appoint the prime minister. So it was not surprising that he appointed this man, his son, Ilham Aliyev, to the position of prime minister. The president also had the right to appoint members of the cabinet of ministers, one of the important government institutions in Azerbaijan. It had the power to appoint prosecutor general, and it had the power to appoint judges to the Supreme Court. Now, for those familiar with authoritarian states, This is a system that's perfectly suited for jailing and prosecuting government critics. In 2003, Aliyev Sr. died. Now, according to the constitutional changes that he made, his son was an interim president until Azerbaijan held its presidential elections in 2003. Now, you won't be surprised now if I tell you that the son, of course, won these elections. And, of course, they were marred by violations. The only thing that has changed in the history, in fact, of all the elections that we've seen in Azerbaijan take place since the independence is how open these violations have become. And no one is trying to hide it anymore. So you can really watch how ballots are being stuffed at polling stations in Azerbaijan. Journalists are harassed on an ongoing basis when they try to cover these violations. Independent observers are kicked out of the polling stations for recording these violations. And there's very little that the society can do at large. In fact, Azerbaijan, as I said, is yet to see what free and fair elections really means. And I'm afraid if and when that time comes, I think people are going to be shocked because they don't really know what free and fair elections are. Now, during this time of leadership under the Aliyev, lack of horizontal accountability made the regime stronger and resistant to working on feasible reforms. There are today no single social structure that can hold the government accountable, and virtually no media left to report independently. This is just one of the images how police brutally cracks down on street protests in Azerbaijan. Now, according to Freedom House, Azerbaijan has been ranked not free on press freedom and general freedom indexes since 1998. And it's a country that is doing poorly on nations in transit ranking. And just to be clear, on the scale of 1 to 7, 7 here stands for the country being least democratic. Now, let me get back to the stories of brave journalists, men and women, who've risked their lives to cover these stories. In 2005, a journalist and editor-in-chief of a weekly magazine, Ilmar Huseynov, was shot several times in front of his apartment and murdered. The perpetrators ran away, so it was his wife who found her husband in front of her doorsteps. The magazine angered officials. It faced several lawsuits, and its journalists, including the editor, Ilmar, were constantly persecuted and received threats. Huseynov never gave up, and he was committed to doing the journalism that he was doing. Unfortunately, to this day, the investigation into his murder brought no results. Or perhaps it's intentionally not bringing any results. 3 years later, President Ilham Aliyev secured, surprise, surprise, yet another re-election. This was his second term. So to make sure that he can stay in power and rule, a year later, in 2009, there was a countrywide referendum where authorities changed the constitution and scrapped off presidential term limits. By this point, I hope you understand that the term elections and referendum don't mean much in Azerbaijan, in their traditional meaning. It is a formality, more of a show that the authorities like to put on at every election cycle. In another show of force, the same year, authorities decided that the people didn't really need to hear news on the radio waves. Who needed the BBC, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe? So in a quick and hasty decision, approved by the National Parliament, Azerbaijani services for the BBC, for Voice of America, and Radio Free Europe were taken off FM radio waves, just like that. Now, the same year, two of my friends, Emin and Adnan, got arrested. All of a sudden, the authorities were not just after members of traditional opposition parties, but they were also after its modern, tech-savvy, Western-educated youth. Let me rephrase that. They were after those who were not on their side. It was the first time I saw someone I personally knew sent to jail. I was angry, especially knowing the reason why they ended up in jail. You see, Emin and Adnan were founders of two separate youth initiatives. Emin worked with Azerbaijani students who studied abroad in Europe and elsewhere, and Adnan worked with returning alumni, trying to engage them in community work in Azerbaijan. Both networks were quite popular and often collaborated. They organized a series of lectures, they held trainings. They wanted to provide Azerbaijani youth who did not have a chance to travel abroad and receive education abroad to understand what they can do once they graduate, to teach them the skills that other students acquired abroad. This was not something the authorities liked, especially because they had no control or influence over the context of these youth movements and the teachings that they were providing. Emin and Adnan were potential threats to the authority. So, in 2009, they were arrested on hooliganism charges. But I can tell you, and they can tell you if they were here, that they've done no hooliganism. What they did instead was to challenge the authorities. You see, that year, the Ministry of Agriculture in Azerbaijan bought 2 donkeys, and this is why there is a donkey on the slide. They were so special that each costed $41,000. Now, the media in Azerbaijan didn't cover this much because, corruption is such a normalcy in Azerbaijan that if it's the donkeys that the Ministry of Agriculture is using to launder money, so be it. Everyone is used to it. But Emin and Adnan were not used to it, and they were trying to change people's perceptions of corruption and what to do about it. So they ordered a donkey costume, they organized with their friends, and they made a video. It was a political satire, and it was the donkey giving a press conference to Azerbaijani journalists. The donkey, Mr. Heysel, which means a donkey in German, was a very talented donkey. Of course, it was $41,000, so it should be very talented, right? It spoke Azerbaijani immediately as it arrived to Azerbaijan, and it spoke very highly of Azerbaijan. One of the questions the journalist asked was, Mr. Heysel, where would you like to be born if you had a chance to be born as a donkey again? And of course, Mr. Heysel answered, I would like to be born in Azerbaijan. It's the best country for donkeys. Donkeys can do whatever they want here, and they can live happily. Now, for us, it was funny. I see that for you, it also sounds very funny. But the government didn't think it was funny. They weren't really good with political satire. A month after the video went viral, Emin and Adnan were having dinner at a restaurant in Baku when they were attacked by 2 unknown men. They were both beaten severely. Adnan had a broken nose. And when they went to the police to file a complaint about what happened to them, they actually saw the men who beat them up walk freely out of the police station. So Emin and Adnan asked the police officers why those 2 men were walking out freely, to which police responded that they were under arrest and that they will spend the night in jail. They remained in jail, and it wasn't just one night. They were sentenced to pretrial detention, which lasted for months. And when the trial began, which wasn't really a trial, but again, it was a theater of a trial, both Emin and Adnan were sentenced to 2.5 years. Their charge was hooliganism. Now, while Amin and Adnan were in jail, of course, we mobilized. Amin and Adnan were surrounded by friends who also studied abroad or had connections. And so we made it our job to make sure that the government understood the mistake of going after people like us. We had the knowledge, we had the tools, and we had the connections. We literally called and wrote to every single person that we knew who was remotely associated with the governments abroad, with international human rights organizations. And eventually, it wasn't just covered by the human rights organizations calling on the release of the donkey bloggers, but it was the New York Times, the Radio Free Europe, the CNN covering the story. We really made sure that the government understood the mistake. I remember when Hillary Clinton was visiting Azerbaijan that summer, even she mentioned the donkey bloggers in her private meetings with President. So we did well in raising attention and demanding that they're released. And they were released. A year into their sentence, Amin and Adnan were released. But they weren't released with a court order. The court did not take back their official charge. No. They were actually pardoned by the president. And again, it was this sort of payback of the authorities that, don't dare mess with us. We will pardon them. We're not going to retract our accusations that they were hooligans. Now, in 2010, when they were released, Azerbaijan held parliamentary elections. But as we know by now, that these were not elections, that this was just a show, because there were ballot stuffing, carousel voting, the same. And of course, the ruling party won the majority of seats in the parliament. But then came the Arab Spring. We were already watching the Green Revolution in Iran, the uprisings across the Middle East, sparked, there was this hope that something might change in Azerbaijan as well. And so in 2011, a young man named by Elnur Majidli decided to really test the waters and see whether something can actually happen in Azerbaijan. He created a hashtag under Great People's Day, March 11, and asked some of the influential Twitter accounts like mine to tweet the day, tweet the hashtag. And he created a Facebook page, which was something very basic. There were no direct orders. There were no requirements. There were no regulations. There was just a message asking people to express their dissatisfaction with the authorities in any way they wanted. But there were a few things that went wrong. The first thing that went wrong was that at the time, we didn't really quite understand how Facebook worked, of course, and who was on Facebook. Turns out, among the 20,000 people who liked the page, there were also government spies, people from the Ministry of Internal Affairs. So on the day of March 11th, all of the key meeting points that were being discussed on a Facebook page were heavily controlled and guarded by the police. Now, another mistake that our friend Elnur did was that when he was creating the Facebook page, not only did he not ask for permission to put down names of 7 people as organizers of the event, he forgot that one of those people, individuals, was actually in Azerbaijan. 2 days before March 11th, I received a phone call from my father. His first question was whether I was plotting to overthrow the government with my friends. I said, "Hi, Dad." "No, Dad." "Wait, do they really think we're overthrowing the government? Were authorities so intimidated?" Turns out they were. And it was the first time my father, who has been a former parliament member, who's been in politics for most of his life, who was also an academic, told me to be extremely careful and that it would be safe if I didn't go home for a while. At the time, I was already based in Istanbul, Turkey. And I understood his warning when just a few days later, one of those 7 organizers who was mentioned on Facebook and who was in Azerbaijan was arrested. His name is Bakhtiar Hajiev. He is a Harvard graduate. He was a parliamentary candidate in 2010 parliamentary elections. And he was arrested on charges of evading military service. He was sentenced to 2 years, but in fact, he never really ran from military service. He applied for he wanted to be a conscientious objector, and so he was trying to win that case. It was really frustrating to see another friend go to jail. I didn't travel home that year. It was the first time I personally felt the consequence of what I thought were my basic rights and freedoms. That same year, a series of investigative pieces into the illegal businesses of the ruling family started coming through. Khadija Ismail is Azerbaijan's best and most well-known investigative reporter. I'm proud to call her a friend. She discovered many ties and stakes the 2 daughters of President Ilham Aliyev had in Azerbaijan's biggest telecom company. A year before that, one international journalist, with Khadija's help, broke another story about real estate ownership of the children of President Ilham Aliyev in Dubai, worth $75 million. $44 million of that property was owned by the 11-year-old son of President Ilham Aliyev. Now, thanks to the work of journalists like Khadija and Panama Papers, today we know just how wealthy the ruling family in Azerbaijan is and how all of that wealth was accumulated through offshore companies, complicated business schemes, corruption, and money laundering. What is interesting is that official Baku never really responded to any of the investigative revelations about the ruling family, except one of the parliament members who made this very bold commentary in the aftermath of the Panama paper leaks. He said, and I quote, "Who cares what has been revealed about the president?" referring to the Panama Papers. "The president has the right to own a house, a mansion, and even a castle. President doesn't have to live off the salary he withdraws from the ATM. Is Khadija Ismailova even aware of what president deals with? You have no idea whose armpit president must smell and whose hands he must shake just for the sake of implementing large-scale projects," end quote. Now, the revelations of Panama Papers showed the myriad of ways in which 143 politicians, among them 12 national leaders, including our own President Aliyev, could exploit secretive offshore tax havens. Now, many of these politicians have shaken hands with US administration officials, signed contracts, and are US partners in energy, security, war and terror, and so on. And Azerbaijan has been no exception. But these revelations came with a price. In 2012, Khadija received a package. The same package was sent to her brother. The package contained pictures and a CD with footage of her having an intimate relationship with her partner. The footage was filmed in her apartment that she was renting. The package also contained a note that said, "Whore, behave, or you will be defamed." Khadija did not get scared. I remember I was interviewing Khadija's mother for a profile I was doing on Khadija for foreign policy some years later, when her mother told me that not only did the government plant a secret camera, tap the whole apartment, but by sending the package to Khadija's brother, they really hoped he would do something to her. And when I asked Khadija's mother what she meant by something, she sighed and said, well, you know, men kill here when their unmarried sisters have sex before marriage. Now, Khadija's brother didn't kill Khadija, nor did Khadija get scared from the package. At a press conference she organized shortly after receiving the package, she was very strong and she was bold. She said she had no intentions of stopping her investigative work, and that she said, I'm not doing this because I want to find out things intentionally that are for some reason belong to the president. It's just everywhere I look, I find links to the president and his family. As investigative stories continued coming through, so did the crackdown continued. Authorities introduced new regulations for obtaining information. A court order was now required to find out who owns what in Azerbaijan. And just to be on the safe side, the law granted lifelong impunity to all ex-presidents and ex-first ladies. The next target on the government list was another youth initiative called NIDA. It means an exclamation mark in Azerbaijani language. Now, these men were arrested and they were sentenced to various times. The shortest was 6 years, the longest was 8 years. The authorities claimed that they were trying to overthrow the government and that their work was financed by foreign organizations. Now, the youngest of these men was just 16 when he was arrested. In the summer of 2014, following their arrest, offices of international organizations that had presence in the country since the early years of independence were raided. Criminal investigations were launched against Open Society Foundation, IREX, NDI, and all their local partners, including media partners. Tax evasion charges were launched, and at one point, virtually all of the country's well-known activists and NGO experts, including rights defenders, were under arrest on charges of hooliganism, tax evasion, drug possession. In December 2014, Khadija was arrested, and the office of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, where she worked, was raided, sealed, while its equipment was confiscated. Meydan TV, which is a dissident media outlet based in Berlin, closed its office, fearing and anticipating the crackdown on its office and its journalists as well. Independent and freelance journalists were rounded up on a regular basis, questioned, then let go. Some were sentenced to short administrative detentions. There was no place to contest their arrests. They couldn't go to court. They couldn't complain because everything was controlled by the government. Everything is controlled by the ruling government. And most of these journalists today are now expecting decisions of the European Court of Human Rights, where they decided to go. Now, in April 2015, and Khadija is the second on the right, in April 2015, some of these individuals that you're seeing in this picture received lengthy jail sentences. Leading human rights lawyer Intigam Aliyev was sentenced to 7.5 years. He was one of the key lawyers who was representing cases of political prisoners in Azerbaijan at the European Court of Human Rights. Another young rights defender, Rasul Jafarov, was sentenced to 6.5 years. In May 2014, Anar Mehmedli, a leading expert on election monitoring, was sentenced to 5.5 years. In August, leading rights activists and veteran rights activist Leyla Yunus and her husband were sentenced to 8.5 years in jail. And in September of 2015, my friend Khadija was sentenced to 7.5 years in jail. The reason these people ended up in jail was because President Ilham Aliyev was paranoid. He feared that international organizations were in the country to fund an uprising and eventually overthrow him. And to prevent that, People had to be punished. Today, I'm happy to report that many, if not all of those high-profile political prisoners were released, thanks to the efforts of the international community and advocacy, including Khadija. But these men and women should not have spent a day in jail to begin with. And despite their release, there are currently 160 political prisoners, 10 of whom are journalists and bloggers. And just 2 weeks ago, Transparency International, one of the last standing international organizations in Azerbaijan, announced that they will be leaving the country because of the inability to continue their work. And in another attack on the press, authorities launched a tax evasion probe against the only remaining news agency. So where I fit in all of this? My introduction to journalism was in 2009, when just a year after starting my blog, I was invited to join a community of writers at an Italian publication that focused on the Caucasus, the Balkans, and Turkey. But my blog didn't just open the door into journalism for me. I had the honor to share the blogging space in Azerbaijan with just a handful of bloggers, since those were the golden days of blogging and social media in Azerbaijan. It was gaining popularity and momentum, and there was much demand in teaching and sharing knowledge that we were accumulating as we were blogging. So in 2009, I started giving trainings on the use of social media and blogging. It was quite exciting because each training was a learning experience for me as well. Now, one such training introduced me to a small not-for-profit organization called Imagine Center. And its founder was a US-based Armenian scholar who founded the organization in partnership with an Azerbaijani and American scholar. It was a cross-border initiative, a platform that brought together divided by the conflict community representatives and sought ways to understand each other and come up with ideas for future collaboration projects. And involving social media and bringing the social media component became an important part of the Imagine Center's work, given that the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan was keeping the two people from meeting each other. And so, just to give you a little bit of background in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, it was a very brutal conflict. It lasted from 1988 to 1994. It took lives on both sides. Azerbaijan lost 16% of its territory, including the adjacent territories to Nagorno-Karabakh. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. Azerbaijanis who lived in Nagorno-Karabakh, which was an ethnically Armenian region, had to move to different parts of Azerbaijan. And even though the conflict came to an end in 1994 with a ceasefire, it was never really resolved. And to this day, the conflict still quite unfrozen. In fact, in April of last year, we all thought we were going to enter another war with Armenia. It lasted 4 days. A lot of men died. And the two parties are yet to come to terms and to reach an agreement. One side is calling for territorial integrity. The other side is calling for self-determination. Now, given this conflict, given the context, at home, war rhetoric is part of this rubber-stamped government policy. As a result, engaging in any kind of cross-border work comes with a price. And often, and especially these days, it's interpreted as an act of treason. My first cross-border collaboration with an Armenian journalist took place in 2009. That year, we were invited as trainers at a regional workshop that had youth from Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. And as trainers, we focused on the role of social media in community organizing, in projects, and transforming conflict-torn societies. Now, it happened that the training was organized really close to a small village that was populated by ethnic Azerbaijanis. So the curious journalists we are, Annika and I decided to take a short trip to the village. And we were fascinated by the community. They met us with open arms. We talked about their lives in the village. We talked about what it meant to live with Armenians at a time when the conflict was still ongoing, because Georgia is a very unique example in a way that there are still villages where you have both Armenians and Azerbaijanis who live there together. So we had these amazing stories told to us by these wonderful men and women, but we also stumbled upon a village wedding preparation. And village weddings are very different from normal weddings. It's a lot more colorful, it's smaller, everyone comes together, and people drink their homemade wine. And given that it's Georgia, there was a lot of homemade wine, of course, and this amazing food. And we were the guest of honors. Both of us got invited to come to the party in the evening. And what later came out of that short trip of curiosity was a story that we published on this Italian outlet that we both were writing for. But being the curious journalist I am, I really wanted to work more with journalists from the other side, and also with journalists from Azerbaijan. Because by this point, I was so frustrated by how the conflict was covered in Azerbaijan, and how people like us, people who engaged in collaborative projects or cross-border work, were portrayed by these journalists in Azerbaijan. We were labeled a lot of unpleasant things, and I wanted to change this. And I wanted to see whether it was possible to bring them together, journalists from Armenia and Azerbaijan, and have them spend time together, have them talk about the conflict, the history of the conflict, talk about the needs, the fears, the concerns that these journalists had, in order to understand that they should stop dehumanizing one another when covering the conflict. Now, I don't think I ever really found answers and found solutions to this. I mean, this was a very wild dream I had in my head. But what I did see from the work that I did carry out with journalists from both sides was that people wrote what they were paid to write when they went back home, and what their editors were told to cover, especially given the political sensitivities of the conflict. Humanity mattered little, while conflict-sensitive reporting and journalism ethics was not widely popular. I was still determined to change that perception. I didn't give up. So when I was invited to join a small newspaper in Turkey that was run by a Turkish-Armenian community, I was full of hope. It was published in Turkish and Armenian, and it was published once a week. It was run by a community of Turkish and Armenian journalists whose editor, unfortunately, was killed in 2007 in front of the newspaper office in Istanbul. I was to be their Azerbaijan correspondent. So during my time at the paper, I wrote mostly about Azerbaijan, political events, developments, elections, whatnot. I covered events that were taking place in Istanbul that were related to Azerbaijan. And I wrote as much as I could about importance of bringing the human factor into the conversation about conflict and covering the conflict. A year into my work at the paper, I realized the hard way, sadly, there was no hope. In fact, it was a perfect excuse for my government to come after me. During the summer of 2014, I found myself the target of online defamation campaign. I was labeled an enemy of the state, a sellout, a traitor, and last but not least, a whore. Online sexual harassment was the gravest. My ethnic background was questioned. My family ethnic background was questioned. Was it my mother, a whore from Armenia, or was it my father, a traitor from Azerbaijan who married an Armenian whore and who bore children with her? And all of this was discussed on social media platforms. These discussions were shared under the stories that featured my act of treason, and suddenly I was a topic of discussion among government mouthpiece newspapers. On television shows, presenters discussed why I would be so angry with the authorities to be such a traitor, to commit such an act of treason. In fact, one TV commentator even came up with the theory of why I was so angry. He said it must have been the time when I brought my father's body from Turkey to Azerbaijan, and when the police at the airport inspected the coffin for drugs. That was his theory. Obviously, he was wrong, and even if it was inspected, it's a procedure, so why I would be angry. Now, it was a very interesting experience because on social networks, people who said these things, they didn't know me. Users discussed the many ways of punishing me. Should I be hanged by my feet and tortured? Should I be extradited from Turkey back to Azerbaijan and punished? Should I be killed right away? Or should I be raped over and over before I'm left to die? These were the things that were discussed. Death threats were sent to my inbox on Facebook, on Twitter. One user even knew where exactly to bury me. He suggested that I belonged in a grave next to Hrant, who was the editor of this Armenian-Turkish newspaper. Now, this creative artist went a step further. So the man who's holding me is the president of Armenia. I'm fixing his bow tie. And the man in the back is my father, drawn on his grave, holding his face with his hand, ashamed of my acts. It was quite interesting to watch all of this happen. And I must confess, my cross-border work was my own blessing and a curse. While I believed in peace and that it was possible to transform a community that is torn by conflict, having the right tools, having the right policies, the authorities in Azerbaijan used this against me. They knew that the best way to target me for my work as a journalist was to unleash an army of haters, and it didn't really take them much effort, really. It was as simple as that. For the authorities, it didn't matter that the same year that they've been labeling me a traitor, I was accused of treason. The BBC named me one of the 100 women changemakers. They were upset, in fact, that this happened. They even questioned BBC's credibility because they wanted to see the First Lady among those 100 women changemakers. But my story doesn't end here. You see, I'm the lucky one. I didn't receive a package with my pictures and a CD of me having sex with my partner. I didn't get prevented from leaving the country, which is what my friend Khadija is facing at the moment, despite her release from jail. I'm lucky because I don't have a sibling in jail. I'm like Emin Husseinov. I'm lucky I didn't have to spend 10 months in hiding in a Swiss consulate like this gentleman. I'm lucky because I've not been tortured while in pretrial detention. I had my teeth broken, unlike this journalist, Nijat Amiraslanov. I'm lucky because I've not been abducted from a different country, like journalist Afgan Mukhtarli, who has been kidnapped in Georgia, where he lived, and taken across border with a bag over my head, against my will, and sentenced to pretrial detention on charges of crossing the border illegally. I'm lucky to stand here and be given the honor to share with you these stories, as well as the story of my own. Azerbaijan is a place where media freedom is a distant concept. It is a place where, as of March of this year, access to independent and opposition websites has been blocked on a regular basis. It is a place where there are no checks and balances. It is a place where independent journalism is perceived as a threat. But for those who serve as the mouthpiece, rewards are abundant. And what I mean by this is, just this summer, 255 journalists were given free flats for their well-deserved service in journalism. This is against any kind of journalism ethic. But as I told you earlier, journalism ethic doesn't really matter in Azerbaijan. I'm not optimistic about the future. With Ilham Aliyev holding strings to all power institutions in Azerbaijan, and his 18-year-old son, who was the 11-year-old son who owned the $44 million worth property in Dubai, is being groomed to hold some government position. So I have no illusion about change in leadership. What I do know and continue to strongly believe in is the art of storytelling. And that I'm not ready to give up on just yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Arzu.
Thank you.
How do you view the role of journalist as a reporter of what's taking place and the role of journalists trying to create a change outcome?
In Azerbaijan?
Journalist.
Well, as a journalist, I mean, one of the first things that you learn as a journalist is to stick to the facts, cover as much ground as you can, and provide as objective view as possible to the story that you're writing on. And I think this is what's important, and this is what I see myself and journalism in general today. And I see this as what needs to continue happening.
Do you see colleagues, however, who, as right as the outcome may be, is that that the purpose of the journalism is indeed to tell the stories that bring a different, bring change?
Well, I definitely think that in many ways, especially now, stories that are being written, especially from countries like Azerbaijan or like Turkey, where I live now, are meant to bring a change. Not necessarily within immediate future, but to sow a seed of understanding that this particular situation needs to change, and there needs to be an attention and understanding, and this what ought to happen eventually.
A question from Twitter: is the internet open in Azerbaijan? Does Western news get in?
Internet is open, and you can access Western news. But as I mentioned, the surveillance over internet and internet resources that are being published in Azerbaijani by independent and opposition media has been under tremendous pressure, especially in the last few months. And there are instances where access to these websites is blocked. And every once in a while, we get reports from our readers telling us they cannot access the page. So while the international media is open, the local media is closed. And what's really important is the language. So when you look at the spoken language in Azerbaijan, you have Azerbaijani, which is the native, you have Russian, which is the second language, and then you have Turkish and English. So you have a lot of the media coming in from these countries, which is widely read. And in fact, I would say Turkish media is quite popular in Azerbaijan these days.
What is the role of religion in the authoritarian regime in Azerbaijan?
That's a very good question. So our authorities, our leadership, namely President Ilham Aliyev, prides himself in being this modern leader. He also prides himself in being the leader of a country where there is religious tolerance. But strangely enough, when he speaks of religious tolerance, he doesn't talk about the Islamic groups that are within the country. He talks about Christian groups, and he talks about Jewish communities. For some reason, he always misses the opportunity to speak about the Muslim groups, and this is precisely because the Muslim community in Azerbaijan and the religion in Azerbaijan has become to play a much bigger role in the community. And this is because a lot of the believers these days, they turn to religion because they have no other place to turn to. You know, in an environment where you don't have media freedom, you don't have thriving civil society, you don't have alternative places for youth to go, religion has become a safe haven. And for this reason, one of the leaders of the religious movement in Azerbaijan is currently serving a life sentence. You know, authorities didn't like his preachings. Authorities didn't like that he was critical of the government policies and the corruption that was taking place in the country. And so Islam has traditionally played a very interesting role in the country. You know, it went from a country being worshipping fires to being occupied under the Persian Empire, so turning into Shia Muslim, and then living under the Soviet Union for 70 years and forgetting its religious ties, and now coming back to a place where religion is becoming much stronger, especially in terms of safe haven, really.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the United States and Azerbaijan? Do we provide aid of any sort? Do we have a presence in the country?
Yes, thank you for that question. U.S. presence in Azerbaijan starts from the diplomatic mission. There is the embassy. But then it also is divided among, or used to be divided among, the presence of DC-based organizations. So we had NDI, we had IRIX, we had OSI, and a lot of these organizations opened up offices way back during the independence years, and they've been partnering and building civil society on the ground. Now, this is the civil society side of things. On a more political scale, Azerbaijan has opened its airspace for US military to travel to Afghanistan, their collaboration on security side of things. But what is also interesting is that Azerbaijan is very good lobbying US officials. I did a story in 2016 on the American-Azerbaijan Alliance, which was an organization that was initiated by son of a minister of transportation of Azerbaijan. And basically it was a money laundering machine whereby the son of the minister hosted these gala events, invited government officials, and lobbying for favors with the US officials. So you also have that kind of relationship. And then you have the relationship under the Trump administration, and that is even more fascinating. There was actually a really interesting story in the New Yorker that came out on the 15th of August, and that looks into the ties that the Trump Tower has to some of these authoritarian regimes, including Azerbaijan. So lots of very different levels of relationship between US and Azerbaijan.
Couple questions about press freedom in Turkey and one in terms of what's going on in Venezuela. And the questioners asked for your comments on what you see happening in those countries in terms of freedom of the press.
Well, unfortunately, you know, Turkey was once, especially for us people from Azerbaijan, a place of hope. Our journalists, our opposition always looked and saw Turkey as the place where they wanted to see Azerbaijan reach the same level of freedoms and rights. But unfortunately, these days this is not the case. At the moment, there are 165 journalists behind bars. Over 200 media outlets have been shut down. In addition to this, of course, there are hundreds of thousands of people who've been purged, who've lost their jobs. There are academics, there are teachers, doctors, lawyers. But overall, the situation with press freedom is quite grim, and it is reflected in a number of reports that cover press freedom in Turkey, and it doesn't, unfortunately, look like it's going to improve. President Erdogan is very strong than ever, and he is extremely annoyed by any kind of independent mind that comes out and talks about what is happening in Turkey, including journalists, and this is why you have 165 journalists behind bars today. And a lot of these journalists are actually tried on terrorism charges, which has become a very popular charge that was introduced after the failed military coup. So in general, there is lack of press freedom and deteriorating situation of press freedom everywhere in the world. I think it was actually covered by the Freedom House report that we've seen a global decline in press freedom everywhere, and Venezuela is no exception. And I mean, Venezuela has always been one of those closed societies where it was really hard to find answers of what was going on. And in my conversations with Venezuelan journalists, you've heard these horror stories about the experiences that journalists have and what they're facing. So unfortunately, I have nothing positive to say, only that it's getting worse. And I'm questioning always this word worse, because to me, when you have 165 journalists in jail in the 21st century, worse is not enough to describe this.
On that rather sad note, what advice do you have for American journalists currently being labeled enemies of the people?
Welcome to the club. It's fun. It's a badge of honor, really. So carry it with, pride. On a serious note, I think don't give up and don't even pay attention, because this has been one of the things that we've been doing in Azerbaijan and in Turkey. Being labeled, being threatened is one way of intimidating you and silencing you. And this is the best possible outcome that an authoritarian regime could have in return. So don't give in and continue doing what you do best, which is journalism and stories, and do it as best as you can and cover the facts and do as much investigative reporting as possible, because I think this is the future of journalism, exposing, putting people on the spot and showing how wrong they are and accusing us of being traitors.
Could you talk a little bit about the educational system in Azerbaijan?
Sure. It's you have high school education until 12th grade, and then after that you take university entrance exams to attend universities, and after that you're free to pursue master programs or PhD programs. The problem with the education system in Azerbaijan is that it's corrupted. You can get your high school diploma paying your way through. You can get your university diploma paying your way through. We have uneducated doctors, we have uneducated accountants, we have uneducated lawyers, and it's no secret. And yet they are practicing their profession. I don't know how. We have a very old system of education. In fact, it dates as far as back to the Soviet Union. The former Minister of Education was not really into reforms. And when he was replaced finally by a young man, who happens to be a distant friend, we were always really hopeful that he's going to be the change that we needed in our education. Unfortunately, it didn't happen, and he kind of fell into the system of corruption. And so it is a very tightly controlled system where you are learning everything by memory. Analytical capacity is not welcomed. The moment you start questioning the theory in the book that you disagree with, the teacher sits you down and smacks you on the head, telling you that, no, sit down, you have to memorize this. So it's very outdated, a very corrupted education system, which is sadly a big disappointment, because during the Soviet Union, Azerbaijan's education system was quite good. It was equal. Men and women went to schools. They were excellent doctors, excellent artists and historians and authors. And it's very sad to see our education system reach the stage where it is now, where it's just mind-boggling how little quality education one can get in public schools and universities, for that matter.
Do you think print media and online journalism are equally vulnerable to control by authoritarian regimes?
Yes. I mean, look at Azerbaijan. All media that is currently made available, which according to our government statistics is some 3,000, is all government controlled. If it's not the ruling party, it's the family member. If it's not the family member, it's the cousin of the family member. If it's not the cousin, then it's a businessman who is related to the government. And it's the same with digital media. Taking it out of the context, I think this is the danger of the authoritarian regimes, is that they can hold control and power over these very important means of information, sources of information for the audience.
Is the CIA active in Azerbaijan? If you could know.
I don't know. Maybe.
I guess that's good. Question, what can we as Americans do to assist in opening the media in authoritarian countries like yours?
Thank you. I think one of the easiest things to do is advocate on our behalf to our government to continue pressure our government to give us the space, to give us back the space that we had in order to do journalism, in order to be able to do stories. Writing letters to your representatives in the government, urging them to encourage to move away from lobby firms, to move away from this spending spree that our Azerbaijani government is so good at in Washington, D.C., organizing these events and fooling everyone into thinking that Azerbaijan, this is beautiful, blossoming democratic state. Read as much as you can, support independent journalism in the US, and really value what you have, because you have the power to influence and you have the power to support, which is really, I think, important, and really just use it while you can. And hopefully you will be able to use it for a much longer time.
And then I have a questioner who begins, thank you for your bravery, and asks, about your ability to see and communicate with your family, and whether they are, under any pressure or punishment because of your role.
My brother was punished for my work for a while. He moved out of the country in 2015, but up until then, He was arrested, he was detained on several occasions, he was questioned, he was forced into calling me and telling me to give up my job, to stop writing, and to stop doing investigative work. He was held for days on in pretrial detention facility without food, without water. And I think he still blames me for everything that happened to him, unfortunately. Even though I did warn him. I did warn him that my job will probably have repercussions on him. And unfortunately, my father passed away in 2012. And the worst thing about living in exile and not being able to go home is not being able to visit his grave, which is in Azerbaijan. And my mom is in Turkey with me. She knows some parts of the story, but I've chose not to enlighten her with the details, especially when she was being discussed online. And she is extremely supportive. And now I feel much better that my brother is out of the country because he won't be used as a bait against me. But yeah, this is the final status of the immediate family.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Arzu Geybulla for bringing this compelling story to us today.